As Naomi Carter stepped into the first-class cabin of Flight 247 from New York to Los Angeles. She felt the familiar hum of the aircraft beneath her heels and the cool rush of air conditioning against her skin. Clutching the strap of her leather carry-on, she allowed herself a small breath of relief. The past few months had been a whirlwind of preparation for this moment, an important business presentation that could define the next phase of her career. Dressed in a sleek navy pantsuit with a crisp white blouse, Naomi exuded the kind of confidence that had carried her through years of relentless ambition and quiet battles. Yet, as she approached seat 2A, her assigned spot, the relief she felt quickly dissipated. A middle-aged flight attendant, Barbara Langley, stood near the aisle, her blonde hair pinned into an immaculate bun, her uniform pressed to perfection. Naomi offered a polite nod, preparing to settle in, when Barbara suddenly stepped in front of her, blocking her path with a tight-lipped smile that did little to mask its stiffness. "Excuse me, ma'am," Barbara said, her voice clipped and professional but laced with something else, something Naomi had heard too many times before. "May I see your ticket?" Naomi hesitated for only a second before pulling out her phone and showing the digital boarding pass. "Of course. Here you go. Seat 2A. Barbara's eyes flicked over the screen, her brow tightening as if something didn't quite add up. Then, her gaze lifted to meet Naomi's. Scrutinizing, questioning. "Are you sure this is the right seat?" A chill ran through Naomi's spine. Not because she was confused, she wasn't, but because she had seen this before. The moment of hesitation, the pause, the unnecessary doubt, the unspoken suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she didn't belong here. "Yes," Naomi replied, keeping her voice even. "I booked this seat weeks ago." Barbara's smile didn't waver, but her posture stiffened. "There may have been a mistake. I'll need to double-check with the system." Naomi's breath hitched. A mistake? She resisted the urge to cross her arms, knowing that any sign of defensiveness could be misinterpreted. "I don't believe there's a mistake," she said carefully. "I have the confirmation email if you need to see it." Barbara's lips twitched slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing over her expression before she turned sharply toward the galley. "One moment, please." As the seconds stretched into minutes, Naomi could feel the weight of the other passengers' eyes on her. Some barely concealed their curiosity, peeking over their newspapers or pretending not to watch while they whispered behind their hands. A businessman in a dark suit glanced at her, then at Barbara's retreating figure, his gaze unreadable. Naomi's stomach tightened, but she kept her posture composed, refusing to let irritation or embarrassment show on her face. Still, the familiar anger simmered beneath the surface. She had fought too hard, worked too long, climbed too many mountains to be treated like an imposter in a space she had every right to be in. Barbara returned with a printed passenger manifest in hand, her expression neutral but her tone anything but. "It appears your seat assignment is in question. I'll have to ask you to move to the economy cabin while we sort this out." Naomi's pulse spiked. Move to economy? She felt heat rise to her cheeks. But she remained poised, her voice controlled. "That's not possible. My boarding pass clearly states 2A. This is my seat." Barbara gave a tight, condescending smile. "Ma'am, I don't think raising your voice will help." Naomi's fingers curled around the strap of her bag. Raising her voice? She hadn't even spoken above a calm, controlled level. But that was how it always happened, wasn't it? A black woman standing her ground suddenly became aggressive, difficult, confrontational. "I'm not raising my voice," Naomi said coolly. "I'm asking you to correct your mistake." Barbara's gaze hardened. "Sometimes errors occur in the system, and we must accommodate accordingly. If you don't comply, I'll have to call security." Call security? Naomi felt a sharp pang in her chest. Barbara wasn't making a request, she was issuing a threat. For a split second, Naomi considered sitting down in her seat and refusing to budge. But she knew how this played out. A call to security. An escalating scene. Her presence being treated like a disruption. She knew the narrative all too well. And she was tired of it. A voice cut through the tension before she could respond. "Is there a problem here?" Both women turned to see Ethan Reynolds, a tall man in an understated blazer and jeans, standing near the cabin divider. He was watching the exchange carefully, his sharp gaze bouncing between Naomi and Barbara. Barbara's demeanor shifted slightly, her spine straightening as a flicker of recognition crossed her face. "Oh, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice softening just a fraction. It's just a seating issue. I'm handling it. Ethan's expression remained unmoved. And by handling it, you mean asking a paying first-class passenger to move without cause? Naomi exhaled slowly, the first real sense of relief creeping into her chest. Barbara's face flushed, her authority suddenly questioned. It's just a precautionary measure. A precaution against what? Ethan's voice was even, but his presence was commanding. Against a black woman sitting in first class? A few audible gasps rippled through the cabin. Barbara blanched, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling to find the right words. Naomi watched as something in Barbara's face shifted. Not an admission of wrongdoing, she would never admit it, but awareness. Awareness that she had been caught. Ethan turned to Naomi and nodded toward her seat. Miss Carter, please take your seat. You belong here. Barbara swallowed, forcing out a tight, forced smile. Of course. My apologies, Miss Carter. Naomi didn't acknowledge the apology. She simply sat down, adjusting her bag beneath the seat, her heart still pounding in her chest. As Ethan walked back to his seat, Naomi caught his eye and nodded. Grateful. He returned the gesture, his expression unreadable but assured. Barbara moved stiffly toward the galley, avoiding Naomi's gaze as she resumed her duties. But Naomi knew this wasn't just about her anymore. The entire first-class cabin had seen it. And they would remember. The moment hung thick in the air, the weight of injustice pressing down on Naomi Carter's chest like an iron bar. The first-class cabin had gone silent. Passengers watching, waiting, some with morbid curiosity, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats, unsure whether to intervene or to pretend they hadn't seen the blatant act of discrimination unfold before them. Barbara Langley, the flight attendant, stood rigid, her artificial smile tightening like a vice, her grip on the printed manifest firm, as though she held the authority of the universe in her hands. Naomi, standing tall, felt her blood simmer beneath her skin. This wasn't about a simple mistake. It never was. It was about doubt, about questioning, about the way people like her were made to prove themselves over and over again in places they had every right to be. Then, like the shifting of a tide, a voice cut through the unbearable silence. Is there a problem here? The voice was deep, steady, filled with a quiet authority that seemed to still the very air around them. Naomi turned slightly, her breath catching as she saw him, Ethan Reynolds. A man she didn't recognize immediately, but whose presence was impossible to ignore. He was calm, composed, but there was something in his eyes, sharp, calculated, watching. The tension in the cabin shifted, almost imperceptibly, but Naomi felt it like the first crack in a frozen lake. Barbara straightened, a flicker of recognition in her eyes, her rigid stance momentarily faltering. "Oh, Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost rehearsed, like a performer slipping into a more submissive role. Naomi's stomach twisted. This was someone important, someone she hadn't expected to intervene. Ethan didn't move closer, didn't loom or throw his weight around. Instead, he simply tilted his head, assessing, peeling apart the layers of the situation like a seasoned strategist who had seen too many of these moments before. His gaze swept over Naomi, not with pity, not with condescension, but with understanding. Then his attention snapped back to Barbara, his expression unreadable. "You said there's a problem with her seat?" Ethan asked, voice deceptively light, but laced with something Naomi recognized instantly: power. Barbara's throat bobbed. There was an error in the system. "I was just..." "An error?" Ethan's brow lifted slightly, the disbelief subtle but razor sharp. "And your solution was to ask her to move? Without verifying the mistake first?" Naomi felt her heartbeat quicken. Barbara's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping in like a slow-moving storm. "I was following standard protocol." Ethan exhaled, slow and controlled. "No," he corrected, "you weren't." The silence that followed was deafening. Barbara looked like a trapped animal, cornered, desperate to find an escape route. "Mr. Reynolds, I was only trying to ensure there were no issues." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "And yet, the only issue here seems to be your assumption that Miss Carter doesn't belong in first class." A flicker of shame flashed in Barbara's eyes before it was quickly smothered by forced composure. Naomi's fingers clenched at her sides. She wasn't sure how to feel. Relief? Gratitude? Anger that it took a man like him, someone with influence, power, Presence. To make people like Barbara second-guess their prejudice? Would Barbara have backed down if Ethan weren't someone she recognized? The thought burned in Naomi's chest. Barbara opened her mouth again, but Ethan silenced her with a single, piercing glance. Miss Carter will remain in her assigned seat, and I expect you to ensure that she has a comfortable flight from this moment forward. His tone was polite, deadly polite. Barbara nodded stiffly, her face coloring, before turning sharply toward the galley, retreating into the safety of her domain. Naomi sat down slowly, her fingers trembling slightly as she adjusted her carry-on bag under the seat in front of her. The tension still hung thick in the air, the weight of dozens of eyes pressing against her skin like an unspoken chorus of thoughts she couldn't quite decipher. Then, Ethan moved. He didn't return to his seat immediately. Instead, he crouched down slightly, just enough so that only she could hear him. "I'm sorry," he said, voice quiet, controlled. Naomi blinked, startled. "For what?" Ethan sighed, glancing toward the now closed curtain of the galley. "For the fact that this still happens. For the fact that you had to go through that just to sit in a seat you already paid for." The rawness of the statement nearly knocked the air from Naomi's lungs. She didn't want to feel emotional. She had spent too many years swallowing it down, turning rage into composure, frustration into poise. But the way he said it, so simply, without pretense, without performance, it made something inside her chest ache. She exhaled, meeting his gaze. "I appreciate that." Ethan studied her for a beat longer before nodding, standing back to his full height. "If you need anything, let me know." And just like that, he was gone. Naomi stared at the space where he had just been, her pulse still thudding in her ears. Passengers were still watching, but there was a shift now. Some looked guilty, some embarrassed, some like they wanted to say something but didn't know how. And Naomi? She felt the injustice still burning in her chest. But she also felt something else. A ripple, a crack in the way things had always been. She knew that this moment wouldn't erase years of experiences like this. It wouldn't undo the countless instances where no one had stepped in. But it mattered, because someone did, someone who didn't have to. And as the flight took off, Naomi leaned back in her seat, gripping the armrest, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep into her bones. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. And maybe, just maybe, this was only the beginning. As the hum of the aircraft vibrated beneath him, Ethan Reynolds sat in silence, his gaze fixed on the window. Though he wasn't really seeing the clouds rolling past, his mind was elsewhere, years in the past, in moments that still haunted him, moments that had shaped the way he viewed the world. His encounter with Naomi Carter on the plane had been jarring, but not surprising. He had seen that type of quiet dismissal before, that subtle, casually cruel way that people in power treated those they thought didn't belong. But what made it hit so hard, what made his chest tighten with a familiar, bitter ache, was the memory of his daughter, Maya. Maya was 10 years old the first time Ethan realized the world would see her differently than it saw him. It had been a bright spring morning, and she had been excited, too excited to sit still, her tiny hands gripping the straps of her backpack as they walked toward her elementary school's parent breakfast. Ethan had attended the event before when Maya was younger, but this time felt different. She was old enough now to want to belong, to want to be seen, to want to be accepted. As they entered the crowded cafeteria, children sat in clusters, their parents seated beside them, laughter and conversation filling the space. Ethan had just set down a plate of fruit for Maya when he heard it. A whisper, a single word that made his entire body tense. "Why is her dad white?" The voice belonged to a boy, a kid no older than Maya. But the way he said it, as if something about Maya was wrong, as if she didn't quite fit in, made Ethan's stomach turn. Maya had frozen, her wide brown eyes flicking toward the boy, her little hands curling into her lap. And then came the worst part. The other kids giggled. It was small, fleeting. It wasn't the cruel kind of bullying that made headlines. But it was the beginning of something. Something Ethan couldn't fight for her. Something he couldn't protect her from. Maya didn't say anything. She just sat there, her shoulders slightly hunched, her tiny fingers playing with the hem of her dress, as if trying to make herself smaller. Ethan's heart broke. It wasn't the first time someone had pointed out their differences. He had seen the curious glances from strangers when he held her hand in grocery stores. The way teachers sometimes hesitated when realizing he was her father. But this was the first time he had watched his daughter shrink under that gaze. That night, as Ethan tucked her into bed, she finally whispered, "Daddy, am I different?" Her voice was so small, so fragile, that Ethan's chest tightened painfully. He brushed a strand of curly hair from her forehead, forcing a soft smile. "Of course you are, sweetheart, but that's a good thing. Being different makes you special." Maya's lip trembled. "But I don't want to be special. I just want to be like everyone else." Ethan felt helpless, because he knew that this was only the beginning, the first of many moments where she would be made to feel like she didn't belong. Over the years, it didn't get easier. When she was 12, she came home from school quiet, her usual excitement gone. "What's wrong, baby?" Ethan had asked, setting down his keys. Maya hesitated before mumbling, "A girl in my class asked if I was adopted today." Ethan's stomach dropped. He hated that this was happening to her. Hated that people, even kids who didn't know better, kept making her feel like she had to justify her own existence. And then came the moment that solidified everything for him. She was 14, old enough to start forming her own opinions, old enough to understand the world in a way that left scars. They had gone out to dinner. Just the two of them. A rare father-daughter evening at a small Italian bistro. Ethan had ordered for them, joking about how much pasta they were about to consume when the waiter returned, handing him the check with a polite smile before turning to Maya. "And do you want me to box up the rest for your guardian?" Ethan's blood ran cold. Maya stiffened beside him, her fork scraping against her plate. Ethan kept his voice level, controlled, dangerous in its calm. "I'm her father." The waiter blinked, faltering for only a second. "Oh, my mistake, sir." But it was already too late. The damage had been done. Maya didn't touch her food for the rest of the night. That night, she cried into her pillow. And for the first time, Ethan couldn't comfort her, because he knew the truth. This wasn't something he could fix. No amount of reassuring words would change how the world saw her. So when he saw Barbara Langley on that plane, standing in front of Naomi Carter, questioning whether she belonged in first class, it wasn't just about Naomi. It was about Maya. It was about every moment his daughter had been made to feel like she was something other. Something questioned, something lesser. It was about every child, every woman, who had ever had to prove they deserved to exist in a space that should have already been theirs. Ethan hadn't intervened on impulse. He had intervened because he had been waiting for this moment. Waiting to stand up, not just for Naomi, but for Maya. Because if he let that flight attendant get away with treating Naomi like she was invisible, then what message was he sending to his own daughter? That she should just accept it? That this was the way the world worked? No, he wouldn't let that be the lesson. Not for Naomi. And not for Maya. As Ethan sat in his seat now, staring out the window as the plane soared through the sky, he made a silent promise. The next time someone questioned his daughter's worth, she wouldn't have to fight alone. And if Naomi Carter ever needed someone in her corner again, she wouldn't have to either. Because sometimes, just one person standing up could change everything. And Ethan Reynolds was ready to be that person. Naomi Carter sat in the dimly lit hotel lounge, staring at the black screen of her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. One unread message, from Ethan Reynolds. She already knew what it would say. His offer had been clear, his words still echoing in her mind. "Help me change this. Make sure this never happens again, not to you. Not to anyone." She could still hear the determination in his voice, the quiet urgency laced beneath his carefully measured words. But it wasn't that simple. Her entire life, Naomi had fought battles she hadn't asked for. She had learned how to navigate corporate spaces with the precision of a strategist. Dodging biases, sidestepping subtle dismissals, forcing herself to prove, time and time again, that she belonged. She had smiled through condescension, endured questions about whether she was really qualified, and had perfected the delicate balancing act of being assertive without being labeled aggressive, of being strong without being intimidating. She was exhausted, and yet, here was Ethan, offering her one more battle. One that wasn't just about her. Naomi leaned back against the plush chair, rubbing her temples as memories of the asterisk flight, the confrontation, the quiet humiliation, the fight for her own seat, asterisk flooded back. Her first instinct when Ethan had made his offer was to say no. To walk away. To let someone else fight this war. Because that's what it felt like, a war. And she was so tired of fighting alone. But wasn't that the problem? Didn't the world count on people like her walking away? Didn't it depend on the exhaustion, the weariness, the slow, crushing weight of frustration, to silence the ones who had every reason to speak? Naomi closed her eyes, a sharp pang of emotion clawing at her chest. She thought of her mother. Of the stories she had told her about how she had fought to get through medical school. About how she had endured professors questioning whether she was capable. About how she had been mistaken for a nurse, not once. Not twice, but countless times, because the world refused to believe that a black woman could be the doctor in the room. Naomi had always sworn to herself that she would never let people make her feel small like that. And yet, she had felt exactly that when Barbara had stood in front of her and doubted her right to be in first class. Like she had been made small. Like she had been told, without words but with absolute clarity, that she didn't belong. The anger, the hurt, the quiet resignation she had tried so hard to swallow that day, it all came rushing back. Naomi's fingers clenched around her phone. No, she wouldn't walk away. She wouldn't let this moment be just another story. Another incident that people forgot. Another wound that never healed. This wasn't about fighting another battle. This was about making sure no one else had to. She exhaled sharply, then unlocked her phone, her thumb hovering over the unread message. Ethan's words were simple, direct. I hope you'll consider it. We need voices like yours. Naomi swallowed hard. Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she typed, "Let's talk." And just like that, she had made her choice. And it terrified her. The next afternoon, Naomi sat across from Ethan in a quiet corner of the hotel's private lounge. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension, the weight of her decision still settling in her chest like a stone. "I'll be honest," she said finally, her fingers tightening around her cup of tea. "I don't trust corporate apologies. They always sound good, but they rarely mean anything." Ethan nodded slowly, as if he expected her skepticism. "I get it. Do you?" Naomi tilted her head, her gaze sharp. "Because I've seen this happen before. Companies promise change. They hire diversity officers, hold workshops, make flashy statements, and then, 6 months later, everything is back to normal." Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "That's exactly why I need you." Naomi let out a humorless laugh. "You need me to fix your company's problem? That's not my job." Ethan shook his head. "No, you don't have to fix it. But you can help make sure we do. You can make sure this isn't just another empty promise." His voice was steady, but there was something deeper beneath it. A realness she hadn't expected. "You want me to consult?" she asked slowly. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "We overhaul our policies. We restructure our leadership approach. And you help guide the process. No corporate fluff. Real, measurable change. And I don't want someone who will just check a box and smile for the cameras. I want someone who will hold us accountable. And if we fail, I want you to be the first person to call us out." Naomi sat back, studying him. Could she really trust him? Could she believe that this wasn't just another damage control effort to protect the airline's reputation? She thought of her mother. Of herself. Of every woman who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. Maybe she didn't owe this company anything. But she owed them. She owed the little girl who might sit in first class one day and not have to justify why she was there. She owed the people who had fought so hard for her to have a seat at the table in the first place. She took a deep breath, steadying the fire in her chest. "All right," she said finally, her voice clear, unwavering. "I'll do it." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable, maybe relief, maybe respect. But Naomi wasn't doing this for him. She was doing it for every person who had ever been told they weren't enough. And she wouldn't let them down. Naomi Carter stood at the entrance of the sleek glass office building. Staring at the revolving doors that reflected the world behind her. She could turn around, walk away, pretend she never got on that flight. Never had to relive the humiliating moment that made her feel like a stranger in her own success. She had spent years learning how to push through. How to swallow the sting of doubt. How to keep her head high even when the world tried to make her small. And now, here she was, walking into a place that wanted her help to fix a system that had never made space for her to begin with. Her hands clenched at her sides. She wasn't doing this for them. She was doing this for every person who had ever felt like they didn't belong. For the woman who had smiled through gritted teeth when a colleague took credit for her idea. For the man who had been dismissed as too angry just for asking to be heard. For the little girl who would grow up believing she had to be twice as perfect just to be seen as equal. Taking a slow breath, Naomi pushed through the doors. The air inside was crisp, cold with the quiet hum of power and precision. Naomi moved through the hall, her heels clicking against polished marble, past framed photographs of executives, smiling, confident, mostly white. She forced herself not to react, but something in her chest tightened. It was always like this. She had spent her entire career walking into rooms like these, feeling the weight of unspoken rules, of invisible barriers built long before she arrived. At the end of the corridor, a glass conference room loomed, and inside, Ethan Reynolds sat waiting. She should have expected him to be early. But what she didn't expect was the look in his eyes when she walked in. Not relief, not victory, respect, as if he knew exactly how much this moment meant. As if he understood that this wasn't just a business decision, but a battle she hadn't wanted to fight, but one she refused to lose. Naomi, Ethan greeted, standing as she entered. Thank you for coming. She nodded, sliding into the seat across from him, keeping her posture poised, controlled. Let's be clear, she said. I'm not here to be a token consultant. If I do this, I do it my way. No empty press releases. No symbolic hires. No performative panels about diversity in the workplace. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. Understood. Naomi tilted her head slightly. Is it? Because what I'm about to do is not going to make people comfortable. Your board? Your senior executives? The people who benefit from things staying the way they are? They're going to push back. Hard. A flicker of something? Determination? A challenge? Crossed Ethan's expression. I know. Then you should also know that if I take this on, I will not back down. And I will not be quiet. Good, Ethan said, his voice steady. I don't need you to be. A pause. Naomi studied him, looking for signs of hesitation, of doubt. At the moment he would tell her to soften her approach. To make people feel comfortable with the change. She found none. That scared her. Because if he actually meant it, if he really wanted change, then that meant she couldn't just walk away when this got hard. And it would get hard. All right, she said finally, folding her arms. Tell me everything. The meeting lasted for hours. And by the time Naomi stepped back into the cool evening air, she felt exhausted, but electrified. This wasn't just about hiring practices or corporate policies. This was about rewriting the foundation of an institution that had never been built with people like her in mind. And Naomi knew exactly what she was up against. She had seen the faces of executives like these before. The ones who nodded politely during discussions about diversity initiatives, but fought tooth and nail when it meant giving up power. The ones who called it progress until it required actual change. Ethan had promised that she would have full control, that she could dig deep, expose the flaws, force accountability. But she had heard promises before. Would he still stand behind her when the people in charge pushed back? Or would he fold like so many others? Time would tell. And if he thought this fight was going to be easy, he was in for a rude awakening. Because Naomi Carter didn't do half measures. She was here to burn down the system that had kept people like her locked out for too long. And she would not stop until it was done. Now it's your turn. If you've ever felt like Naomi, like you've had to prove your worth twice over just to be seen, if you've ever had to fight battles you shouldn't have had to fight in the first place, drop a comment below. Let Naomi know she's not alone. Let's show the world that we see her. We stand with her, and we won't stay silent. Because this isn't just her fight. It's ours. And we're just getting started. Naomi Carter knew this wouldn't be easy. She had expected resistance. She had prepared for it. She had lived with it her entire career. But what she hadn't expected, what had truly rattled her, was just how deeply the roots of the problem ran. It started small, the usual polite, smiling pushback. The executives at North Sky Airlines, the company that had once tried to take her first-class seat from her, had agreed to bring her on as a consultant. They had smiled through the press photos, nodded along as she outlined plans for real, lasting reform, and offered their enthusiastic support. But then the work actually began. Naomi had spent weeks poring over hiring records, promotion data, internal complaints, The kinds of documents companies locked away. The ones that told the real story of who got ahead and who was left behind. And the truth was worse than she expected. Employees of color, particularly black employees, were hired at lower rates, promoted even less, and left the company in droves. Complaints about bias and microaggressions were rarely followed up on. Some were outright ignored. And then there was Karen Langley, the flight attendant who had humiliated Naomi that day, who had stood in her way with a plastic smile and an ironclad sense of entitlement. Karen had complaints against her. Multiple passengers had reported her for rudeness, condescension, dismissive behavior, especially toward women and people of color. And yet, nothing had happened. She had been coached, according to the records, given gentle warnings, but never real consequences. And Naomi knew exactly why. Because Karen was just one person in a company full of people like her. People who had been conditioned to believe that some passengers belonged in first class and others needed to prove themselves. When Naomi brought these findings to the board of executives, she expected them to be horrified. She expected urgency, a rush to fix what was broken. She was wrong. Instead, they shifted in their seats, glanced at their watches, offered the same excuses she had heard 1,000 times before. We're committed to change, but these things take time. Maybe these employees just weren't the right fit for leadership. We don't want to create a culture of fear. Naomi felt her stomach turn. A culture of fear? They were worried about the comfort of the people in power, not the ones being pushed out, dismissed, overlooked. The resistance didn't stop there. As she implemented bias training programs, executives suddenly became too busy to attend. When she rewrote promotion policies, leadership dragged their feet, questioning whether such changes were really necessary. And when she suggested that Karen Langley be terminated, that she was a liability, that her presence sent a message that discrimination had no real consequences, that's when they really pushed back. She's been here for 15 years. They argued. She's one of our best attendants. Isn't this a little harsh? Naomi felt rage coil in her chest. Harsh? Harsh was being told you didn't belong in a space you had every right to be in. Harsh was working twice as hard for half the recognition. Harsh was knowing that no matter how successful you became, people like Karen Langley would still see you as an outsider. They didn't want to fire Karen. They wanted to protect her. Because in their eyes, she was one of them. And Naomi? She never had been. But Naomi hadn't come this far to lose. She gathered every complaint, every report, every account from passengers and employees. She built a case so airtight that even the most reluctant executive had to admit the truth. And in the end, they had no choice. Karen Langley was let go. The official reason? Violation of company values. The real reason? They could no longer protect her. It should have felt like a victory. And in some ways, it was. But Naomi knew this wasn't just about Karen. Karen was a symptom, not the disease. The real fight was changing the system that had allowed Karen to thrive for 15 years without consequence. And that fight? It was far from over. The backlash came quickly. Anonymous emails, threats, flight attendants whispering behind her back. Some employees were grateful. Some were furious. Some were just scared. And Naomi understood why. Because power never gives itself up without a fight. One evening, she found herself alone in her office, staring out at the city lights, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her. She had done everything she had set out to do. And yet, why did it still feel like she was fighting a war she could never win? That's when her phone buzzed. A message from a young flight attendant. I just wanted to say thank you. People don't say it enough. But because of you, I feel like I have a future here. Like I don't have to just put up with it. Thank you. Naomi felt her throat tighten. She let out a slow breath. Then typed back, you belong here. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And for the first time in months, she felt something shift inside her. Because maybe she wasn't winning the war. But she wasn't fighting it alone anymore. Now, it's your turn. If you've ever had to fight for your place, if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told to be quiet, drop a comment below. If you believe that change is worth fighting for, even when it's hard, let Naomi know. Because this fight isn't just hers. It's all of ours. And together, we are unstoppable. Naomi Carter never thought she'd become the face of change. She had only wanted to exist in peace. To take her first-class seat without question. To be seen as a businesswoman, not as a question mark. An anomaly. A mistake that needed to be corrected. But life had a way of pulling people into battles they never asked for. And somewhere along the way, Naomi had stopped running from the fight. She had stepped into boardrooms filled with men who saw her as an inconvenience. She had pushed back against executives who wanted her to be palatable. Easy. A symbol of progress that didn't demand real work. She had refused to be silent. And now, months later, the impact of that decision was rippling outward in ways she never imagined. The first sign of change came in whispers. Flight attendants, especially the newer ones, the ones who had been afraid to speak up before, began to approach her in quiet hallways. Empty break rooms, shadowed corners of airport lounges. Some would nod at her. A silent acknowledgement that they saw her, that they understood. Others would thank her outright. Their voices hushed, their hands gripping hers for a fleeting moment before retreating, as if afraid they would be punished just for aligning themselves with her. And then there were the ones who still didn't know how to feel. I don't know if this was the right way to go about it. One senior attendant admitted to Naomi one evening after a long meeting. Naomi had simply smiled, though there was a sharp edge to it. There is never a right way to make people care about injustice. She had replied, there's only the way that forces them to stop ignoring it. And that was the thing. No one could ignore it anymore. The company had implemented sweeping changes. Bias training was no longer optional. Promotion structures were re-evaluated. Diversity was no longer a word tossed around in public statements. It had teeth now. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but the wheels had started turning. And Naomi wasn't going to let them stop. Then one evening, something happened that broke her. She had been reviewing emails late at night, exhaustion sinking into her bones, when a message arrived from an unfamiliar address. Subject: for Ms. Carter. The email had no formal greeting, no request for a meeting, no press inquiry, no corporate pleasantries, just a simple letter. A letter from a 10-year-old girl. Hi Ms. Carter. My name is Maya. My dad says you don't know me. But I know who you are. He told me what happened to you on the plane. And he told me how you didn't let them treat you like you were invisible. I wanted to say thank you for that. Because I know what that feels like. I know what it's like to be different. I don't always feel like I belong. And sometimes I don't know why. Sometimes people look at me funny. Or they ask me questions that make me feel weird inside. Like I have to explain why I look the way I do. My dad says people don't always mean to be mean. But it still hurts. But when he told me about you, I felt stronger. He said you could have just let it happen. That you could have walked away. But you didn't. And I don't think I should have to walk away either. So I just wanted to tell you that you helped me. You made me feel like maybe one day I won't have to feel weird about being different. Maybe one day I can just be. Thank you, Ms. Carter. Love, Maya. Naomi read the letter 3 times. The first time, she skimmed it, tired and numb, her brain barely processing the words. The second time, her hands trembled, her breath hitching at the quiet ache behind each sentence. The third time, she wept, not just for Maya, but for herself, for the little girl she had once been, the one who had also felt different. The one who had also looked around rooms and wondered if she truly belonged. For the moments when she had been made to feel small, when she had forced herself to smile through slights and condescension, when she had carried the exhaustion of proving herself every single day. And for the first time, she realized that this wasn't just about a job. It wasn't about board meetings or policies or training sessions. It was about people. It was about Maya. About the girls and boys who would grow up watching the world, waiting to see if there was a place for them in it. Naomi had spent her life fighting to exist. Now she was fighting to make sure they never had to. She wiped her tears away, took a shaky breath, and reached for her phone. Her fingers hovered for a moment before she typed a response. Maya, you don't have to thank me. You are strong all on your own. And I want you to know something. You belong. Exactly as you are. The world may try to tell you otherwise. But don't ever let it make you shrink. Don't ever let it make you question your worth. I see you. I hear you. And I am so proud of you. Love, Ms. Carter. She hit send, exhaled, and let the moment settle into her bones. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in a long time, she knew this fight was worth it. Now, it's your turn. Have you ever felt like Maya? Like the world kept asking you to explain yourself? Like you had to prove your place in spaces that should have already been yours? Drop a comment below. Let Naomi know that she's not alone in this fight. Let Maya know that she isn't either. Because this isn't just Naomi's story. And together, we're making sure no one ever fights all of ours. LS invisible again. Naomi Carter stood at the airport terminal, staring at the bright departure screens blinking overhead, listing flights to places she had never been, places she might visit one day when she finally had time to breathe. It had been 6 months since she took on the fight she never asked for. The fight that had started with a single moment of humiliation on an airplane. And now? Now, the world had changed. Maybe not all of it. Maybe not as much as it needed to. But enough. Enough that Naomi could see the difference, in the way people spoke. In the policies being rewritten. In the way employees at North Sky Airlines no longer looked over their shoulders when they spoke up. In the way a young flight attendant had stopped her in the hallway just the other day, gripping her hands tightly and whispering, "Thank you. I didn't think I'd ever see someone like me in these rooms." That alone made every fight worth it. A new path forward. Ethan Reynolds had offered her a permanent position at North Sky, a chance to stay and continue the work she had started. He had looked at her with that quiet intensity of his, the same look he had given her when he first intervened on the plane, when he had stepped into a fight that wasn't his because he refused to let her stand alone. "We need you here, Naomi," he had said. And for a moment, she had considered it. Staying would be safe. Staying would mean securing a leadership role, having power from the inside. But Naomi had spent too many years learning a hard truth. Real change doesn't happen when you get too comfortable. And she wasn't ready to be comfortable yet. So she had looked him in the eye. Her voice steady, clear. "You don't need me, Ethan. You need more people like me. And that's what I plan to make happen." He had nodded, understanding, even though she saw the flicker of disappointment in his eyes. But he respected her decision. He always had. And that made all the difference. Letting go, moving forward. Now, Naomi stood at the gate, her flight ticket clenched in her hand. This time, she wasn't flying as a consultant. This time, she wasn't traveling for work or for some corporate meeting. This time, she was simply going home. And for the first time in a long time, she felt lighter, because she knew that what she had built, the foundation, the movement, the voices she had helped amplify, would continue long after she left. Because she had planted something. Something that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be erased, a legacy, and no one could take that away from her. Lessons we can all carry forward. Naomi's story isn't just hers. It belongs to all of us. Because we have all, at some point, been in a situation where we felt like we had to justify our existence. We've all experienced moments where someone tried to make us feel small, tried to tell us we didn't belong, tried to dismiss us as if our presence was a mistake. And we have all had to make the choice. Do we let it go? Let it slide? Let it happen again? Or do we fight back? Naomi made a choice that changed everything. And you can too. Here are the lessons we can take from her journey. Lessons that we can all apply in our own lives. Speak up, even when it's hard. If Naomi had stayed silent that day on the plane, nothing would have changed. The world doesn't change when we wait for permission. It changes when we demand better. Find allies, but be willing to stand alone if you must. Ethan stood up for Naomi. But she didn't need him to save her. She was already strong. Sometimes, you'll have support. Sometimes, you won't. Either way, keep going. Change is always met with resistance. People in power do not give it up willingly. But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth it. You are not alone. Naomi wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who came after her. Whatever you are facing, someone else has faced it too. And if we stand together, we are stronger than those who want to silence us. Legacy is bigger than a single moment. Change isn't about one action, one fight, one win. It's about what you leave behind. The voices you uplift, the path you clear for those who follow. Naomi's fight didn't end when she left North Sky. It had only just begun. Now, it's your turn. Naomi did what so many of us dream of doing. She fought back. She refused to be silent. She made a difference. And now, the question is, what will you do? If you've ever had to fight for your place in the world, if you've ever been told you didn't belong, if you've ever been made to feel small, if you've ever had to work twice as hard just to be seen, then let Naomi know. Drop a comment below. Tell your story. Let the world know that we are here. We are watching. And we will not be ignored. And if you believe that change is worth fighting for, then, like this video to show your support for Naomi's story. Comment with your thoughts, because your voice matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, someone who needs to be reminded that they are not alone. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire, challenge, and remind us that we are powerful beyond measure. Because this story isn't just about Naomi. It's about all of us. And together, we are unstoppable.